Springfield, Missouri, a quiet Midwestern town where neighbors know each other by name. But in June of 2015, a single alarming message on Facebook would pull an entire community into a mystery unlike anything they'd ever seen. In a modest neighborhood on West Volunteer Way, the evenings were usually calm, the streets still, the kind of place where porch lights glowed softly against manicured lawns, and families settled in after long summer days. The house at the end of the street, pale pink, with a wheelchair ramp leading to the front door, was one that everyone recognized. For years, it had been a symbol of resilience, a place where a mother cared tirelessly for her medically fragile daughter, a home often visited by community volunteers, neighbors, and well-wishers. But on the evening of June 14, 2015, something felt different. The stillness that usually comforted this quiet corner of Springfield felt strangely heavy. Online, a post appeared on a Facebook page shared by the mother and daughter. The message was abrupt, jarring, written in a tone no one had seen from the account before. It immediately caught the attention of friends who followed their lives closely. At first, some wondered if it was a mistake, a hack, or perhaps an attempt at humor. But as minutes turned into hours, concern spread quickly. The neighborhood, normally shielded from disruption, began to feel the tremor of something deeply wrong. The lights in the pink house remained off, the door closed, the ramp empty. Text messages went unanswered. Calls rang through. A sense of unease seeped through Springfield as neighbors whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what the online message could mean. Inside that home, behind the closed blinds and silent rooms, lay a truth that would soon shatter the town's understanding of everything they thought they knew about the mother and daughter who lived there. A truth that would rip open years of assumptions, support, admiration, and sympathy, revealing a story far more complex than anyone could have imagined. In the hours before the discovery, those closest to the family replayed their last interactions, trying to convince themselves that everything was fine. The mother, known for her constant vigilance and care, had never gone silent before. The daughter, believed to rely heavily on her, had never been gone without notice. This sudden absence, this digital message, this unexplained quiet, began to spread an unmistakable fear. By the time night settled fully over West Volunteer Way, the worry had become something urgent, something that demanded answers. Small porch gatherings formed as neighbors exchanged updates. People scrolled through their phones, reading the Facebook post again and again, each time feeling a stronger pull toward the possibility that something serious had happened. This was no longer a misunderstanding, no longer a momentary lapse in communication. It was the beginning of a case that would grow beyond Springfield, beyond Missouri, and beyond anything this quiet neighborhood had ever witnessed. A case that would unravel layers of trust, caregiving, secrecy, and survival, until the world saw a story that challenged the very notion of what a mother-daughter bond could look like behind closed doors. And it all started here, on a quiet street, with a single message, a locked door, and a growing sense of dread that the house on West Volunteer Way held a terrible secret waiting to be uncovered.
Dee Dee Blanchard and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, were known throughout Springfield as a pair closely bonded by circumstance, resilience, and years of medical challenges that shaped almost every aspect of their daily lives. To many, they were a familiar sight at local events, charity functions, and community gatherings, where Dee Dee often appeared at Gypsy's side, guiding her wheelchair, adjusting her blanket, or speaking gently to her in ways that reflected deep care and constant attentiveness. When they moved into their small home on West Volunteer Way, the community welcomed them with open arms. The house itself had been built through charitable assistance, designed to make life easier for Gypsy, who, according to Dee Dee, faced a long list of serious medical conditions. The wheelchair ramp, the wide hallways, and the donated equipment inside the home were all physical reminders of the many challenges Dee Dee said her daughter lived with every day. Neighbors remembered the first time they met them. Dee Dee spoke with calm confidence, explaining Gypsy's medical needs, her supposed fragility, and the ongoing treatments that required frequent trips to specialized clinics. Gypsy, soft-spoken and shy, often smiled politely, her voice quiet, her demeanor gentle. To the people of Springfield, they seemed inseparable, united by a life that revolved around care, appointments, and constant medical supervision. Over the years, the mother-daughter bond became something the community admired. Dee Dee was often described as devoted, patient, and endlessly protective. Gypsy was seen as brave, resilient, and eager to stay positive despite her challenges. Volunteers who visited the home recalled seeing shelves lined with medications, medical records neatly filed, and equipment organized with meticulous attention. Everything seemed to reinforce the narrative of a mother doing everything she could to support her child. Publicly, Gypsy was portrayed as medically fragile, someone who required ongoing help with mobility, nutrition, and daily tasks. Dee Dee shared summaries of Gypsy's reported medical history with doctors, neighbors, and friends, speaking of conditions that reportedly began in childhood and persisted across the years. These details were always presented calmly, factually, and with the confidence of a mother who had dedicated her life to managing them. People accepted what they heard, trusting that a parent would know their child's needs best. Yet, despite the medical challenges described by Dee Dee, Gypsy's spirit left a strong impression on those who met her. She enjoyed dressing up, participating in local events, and taking part in nonprofit programs that supported children with health concerns. Organizations rallied behind them, offering trips, donations, and assistance that eased the financial burden of constant care. Gypsy appeared grateful, often photographed with a wide, hopeful smile that endeared her to many. Their daily routine reflected a life shaped by medical structure. Appointments, medications, equipment maintenance, and rest formed the backbone of their schedule. Gypsy's independence remained limited, primarily guided and supervised by Dee Dee, who managed transportation, communication, and interactions with the outside world. This arrangement seemed natural to many observers, given the information they had been told about Gypsy's health. Friends from the community remembered how accessible and friendly Dee Dee often was. She would wave from the porch, chat with neighbors on the sidewalk, and update them on Gypsy's latest treatments or upcoming procedures. People who visited the house often noted the calm, orderly environment, the medical supplies, and the soft, reassuring manner in which Dee Dee spoke about her daughter's needs. Gypsy, meanwhile, was frequently described as sweet and curious, someone who enjoyed meeting new people and participating in community activities when her health allowed. Many saw her as a symbol of perseverance, a young woman living with extraordinary challenges yet continuing to find joy in small experiences, costume events, movie outings, or simple conversations with fellow volunteers. To the outside world, the narrative seemed clear. Dee Dee was the devoted mother. Gypsy was the medically fragile daughter. Together they formed a household defined by care, adjustment, and the constant presence of medical uncertainty. And the people of Springfield, moved by their story, supported them wholeheartedly, unaware that the reality behind this mother-daughter bond was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined.
For years, the story of Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose appeared to be one shaped entirely by caregiving, routine, and the structure of medical responsibility. Their lives moved in a rhythm that seemed familiar to anyone managing long-term health challenges, a cycle of appointments, checkups, consultations, prescriptions, and careful monitoring that filled their calendar from one month to the next. In Springfield, this reality was accepted without question, reinforced by the constant presence of medical equipment and the frequent visits from healthcare professionals who knew the family well. Dee Dee was often seen guiding Gypsy through hospital corridors, speaking with nurses, organizing paperwork, and discussing treatment plans with a practiced sense of confidence. She carried binders filled with documents, always prepared to reference past tests, previous consultations, or discussions with specialists. To physicians and volunteers alike, she presented herself as a mother who had spent years navigating a complex medical landscape, one appointment at a time. Neighbors recalled how she adjusted her days around Gypsy's needs, planning meals, medication schedules, and periods of rest with precise care. Many described Dee Dee as patient and calm, someone who rarely appeared overwhelmed, even when the demands of caregiving grew heavy. At local charity events, she spoke openly about the support they received from nonprofit programs, expressing gratitude for donated equipment or assistance that helped keep their household stable. Gypsy, meanwhile, seemed to rely on her mother for almost everything. Her independence appeared limited, shaped by the belief that she required ongoing help with mobility and daily tasks. When she ventured outside, Dee Dee was always nearby, attentive and watchful. To those observing from the outside, it looked like a partnership built on trust. A young woman dealing with significant challenges, and a mother who had dedicated her life to managing them. The frequency of their medical visits was something neighbors eventually came to expect. It was common to see the pair loading into transportation services early in the morning, returning late in the afternoon after long days at clinics or hospitals. Sometimes they would come home with new medications, new equipment, or new follow-up appointments that added to the long list of ongoing treatments. Those who knew them noted that their schedule rarely included stretches of unstructured time. Their days were full, planned, and focused primarily on Gypsy's reported health needs. Community volunteers who interacted with them saw a household organized around care. Medical supplies were arranged carefully, feeding equipment was stored neatly, and the small pink bedroom, decorated with stuffed animals and soft lighting, appeared to be a haven of comfort for Gypsy. Visitors often left with the impression that Dee Dee had created a safe and controlled environment to manage her daughter's health. When the family attended nonprofit events, Gypsy was frequently welcomed with enthusiasm. Organizations that supported children with medical conditions often featured her in group activities, fundraisers, or travel opportunities made available to families in need. She was photographed meeting celebrities, visiting theme parks, and participating in programs designed to bring joy and relief to children facing health challenges. Dee Dee accompanied her every step of the way, often expressing heartfelt gratitude to those who helped make these experiences possible. To the Springfield community, this public narrative shaped everything they believed about the family. They saw a mother who had dedicated her life to caregiving and a daughter who, despite her reported medical fragility, maintained optimism and warmth. The consistency of this image, reinforced over years of interactions, helped build a sense of trust that few ever questioned. Behind this carefully maintained routine, Gypsy's world remained limited. Her mobility was often assisted, her daily decisions were largely guided by Dee Dee, and her interactions with others were brief and supervised. Those who knew them accepted these boundaries as necessary, given the medical information they had been told. There seemed to be no reason to assume otherwise. In many ways, the life shared by Dee Dee and Gypsy appeared to be one defined by responsibility, compassion, and sacrifice. From routine checkups to community support programs, everything reinforced the impression of a household built around caregiving. A structure so familiar, so consistent, and so seemingly transparent that no one realized a much more complicated reality existed beneath the surface. Behind the calm exterior of the small home on West Volunteer Way, life for Gypsy Rose was beginning to shift in ways that no one outside the house could see. For years, her world had been a carefully structured routine of medical appointments, supervised outings, and quiet evenings spent watching movies or participating in charity events. Everything around her seemed fixed, predictable, and tightly controlled. But as she entered adulthood, a quiet internal change began to take shape, a growing awareness that the world outside her walls was far larger than she had been allowed to explore. This change was subtle at first. It emerged through questions Gypsy asked about her age, her limitations, and her future. Public records later revealed moments where she attempted to understand details that had never been fully clear to her. Documents showing she had begun asking about independence, about making choices for herself, about forming relationships without supervision. These were small steps, common steps for a young adult, but in her environment, they marked a significant internal shift. During these years, technology became one of the few outlets through which she could privately explore the world beyond her home. Through a shared laptop or a small device she accessed quietly, online spaces offered her something she had rarely experienced: privacy, curiosity, and connection. With each passing month, the internet became a quiet doorway into conversations she could not have anywhere else. It was in these online spaces that Gypsy first encountered communities and individuals who communicated with her freely, responding to her not as a child or a patient, but simply as a person. She learned how others her age lived, the freedom they had, the choices they made, the relationships they formed. These insights, gathered slowly through conversations and browsing, shaped her understanding of what adulthood could look like. Among these online interactions, one connection in particular would later become central to the events of 2015. Through a Christian dating site, Gypsy began speaking with a man named Nicholas Godejohn. Their messages, digital exchanges, and conversations developed gradually, recorded through chat logs that would later become key pieces in the investigative timeline. To Gypsy, the conversations offered something deeply personal, a space where she felt understood, valued, and able to express thoughts she had kept hidden for years. For Nicholas, the relationship developed quickly into emotional attachment, strengthened through long conversations, shared ideas, and a sense of loyalty he felt toward her. Over the months that followed, their relationship continued in private, away from the routine and supervision that shaped her daily life. Gypsy confided her frustrations, her hopes, and her desire for greater independence. She described the limitations she experienced, the strict boundaries around her movement, and the lack of personal agency she felt. In return, Nicholas offered reassurance, comfort, and support. Their bond deepened, becoming a constant presence in her life. Documented messages later collected by investigators revealed increasingly emotional discussions. Gypsy began expressing a desire to create a life where she could make her own choices, something she had rarely been allowed to do. She imagined small freedoms, choosing her own clothing, speaking to people independently, and forming relationships without oversight. These thoughts, common for someone her age, carried a different weight. At the same time, tension inside the home began to surface quietly. These were not outward confrontations, but subtle moments that left Gypsy feeling torn between the world she knew and the world she wanted to explore. She attempted at various times to express the need for more personal space. She tried small acts of independence, actions that, according to later public records, were not always met with understanding. As this tension grew, her communication with Nicholas intensified. She began viewing him not only as a companion, but as someone who might help her step into a new life. Their digital conversations became a private outlet, a place where she felt she could be honest about her fears and desires. In these messages, preserved later as evidence, Gypsy described her longing for freedom and her belief that the only path forward might require drastic change. Despite these internal struggles, the outside world saw no signs of conflict. Neighbors still saw mother and daughter attending appointments, going to charity events, and maintaining the same public routine they had followed for years. Volunteers continued to visit, unaware of the emotional divide forming inside the home. And the community continued to view Dee Dee as a dedicated caregiver, while Gypsy was seen as the medically fragile young woman who depended on her. But inside the house, the distance between Gypsy's controlled environment and her growing inner world expanded a little more each day. The internet, that quiet glowing window into another life, had become her connection to freedom, independence, and belonging. And her relationship with Nicholas, strengthened by hours of private communication, had become the emotional anchor guiding her thoughts about what the future could hold. This growing tension, invisible to everyone around them, marked the beginning of a turning point. It was not sudden, not dramatic,
and not openly acknowledged. It unfolded quietly, step by step, message by message, shaping the decisions that would ultimately lead to the events of June 2015, a turning point that no neighbor, no friend, and no member of the Springfield community could have predicted, one that would forever change the story of the home on West Volunteer Way.
In June of 2015, the quiet routines that had defined the home on West Volunteer Way began to shift in ways invisible to the outside world. The month unfolded like any other, marked by warm evenings, neighborhood walks, and the comforting rhythm of daily life. But inside the small pink house, events were moving toward a turning point that would soon alter everything. Public records and investigative documents later pieced together a clear timeline of the days leading up to the night of June 14th. During this period, Gypsy and Nicholas Gojan continued communicating privately, building plans influenced by months of digital conversation. These plans, exchanged through messages that investigators later retrieved, reflected Gypsy's desire for a life outside the home, guided by her growing dependence on Nicholas and her belief that he could help her break away from the constraints she felt within her daily reality. According to the verified investigation timeline, Gypsy left the house first. She quietly stepped out into the warm June air, moving with caution and awareness, knowing that the decision she was making would lead to irreversible change. Though the street was still in the neighborhood calm, the weight of that moment shaped everything that followed. She walked away from the home she had lived in for years, the place that had defined her world, and waited nearby for Nicholas to arrive. Nicholas traveled to Springfield from Wisconsin, making a long journey by bus to meet Gypsy in person. Surveillance images and transportation records later confirmed his arrival in Missouri. When he reached the neighborhood, he made his way toward the house, moving through a community unaware of the events unfolding in its quiet streets. In the early hours of June 14th, Nicholas entered the home. What happened inside in those minutes is documented only through legal records and investigative statements, and these documents present the events in a factual, non-graphic manner. Dee Dee Blanchard was killed inside the house, marking the moment that would initiate a case unlike any the city had seen. The details surrounding that act remained central to the investigation, forming the basis for charges, court proceedings, and the legal outcomes that followed. While these events took place inside, Gypsy remained elsewhere in the house, not in the room where the act occurred. Afterwards, she and Nicholas gathered some of her belongings, taking with them items that investigators later recovered or documented. They then left the home together, stepping into the night as the neighborhood slept. Their next steps were methodical. According to transportation records, surveillance footage, and statements collected during the investigation, Gypsy and Nicholas traveled to a bus station and boarded a bus bound for Wisconsin. The long journey north unfolded quietly, unnoticed by fellow passengers who had no reason to suspect anything unusual about the pair seated among them. Gypsy, believed by many to be medically fragile and unable to travel independently, moved through the trip without drawing any attention, a detail that later shocked both investigators and the public. Back in Springfield, the hours that followed were filled with normalcy on the outside. Neighbors went through their morning routines. Volunteers checked their messages. Friends scrolled through social media, unaware that the home on West Volunteer Way was silent for a reason no one yet understood. The phone inside the house remained unanswered. Texts went unread, and the pink house that had always seemed full of activity and constant medical routine sat still, with no sign of movement. It wasn't until later the next day that the first hints of concern began to surface. Dee Dee, known for her steady communication and her careful management of schedules, had not responded to friends. Messages lingered without reply. Calls rang with no answer. Those who knew her well found it deeply unusual, a break in a pattern she had never disrupted before. But for the moment, the quiet raised only questions, not alarm. Outside Missouri, Gypsy and Nicholas continued their bus journey, traveling hundreds of miles away from the home where their lives had changed only hours earlier. They arrived in Wisconsin and made their way to Nicholas's hometown, a place far removed from the neighborhood that would soon be thrust into national attention. Back in Springfield, the stillness around the house grew heavier as the day passed. Friends checked in again. Volunteers wondered if something had come up unexpectedly. Neighbors glanced toward the home but saw nothing unusual from the outside. No one yet knew how dramatically the story behind those closed doors had shifted. This period, the quiet hours after the pair left Missouri, formed the space between the act itself and the discovery that would soon send shockwaves through the community. And as evening approached, one online message, posted from far away, would begin unraveling the truth, setting into motion the alarm, the investigation, and the nation's introduction to a case that would soon capture worldwide attention.
As Sunday evening settled over Springfield, what had begun as mild concern slowly turned into something heavier. The neighborhood around West Volunteer Way usually grew quiet after sunset, with families returning indoors and porch lights flickering on. But on June 14, 2015, the silence carried an unfamiliar tension, one that spread quietly through phones, messages, and unanswered calls. It began with a single Facebook post. On the shared profile that belonged to Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose, a short message appeared, jarring in tone, completely unlike anything friends had ever seen from the account. The words were blunt, alarming, and drastically out of character. At first, people assumed it must have been a mistake, perhaps someone hacking the account, or an attempt at dark humor. But within minutes, more comments appeared beneath the post, each more unsettling than the last. Friends who had interacted with Dee Dee online for years felt an immediate sense of unease. She was known for her careful communication, her friendliness, and her measured tone. The sudden shift was impossible to ignore. Neighbors began messaging one another, sending screenshots, asking if anyone had spoken to Dee Dee or seen her that day. No one had. Attempts to contact her continued through the evening. Texts remained unread. Phone calls rang through without answer. For someone whose daily life involved constant coordination, medical updates, event planning, conversations with volunteers, the silence felt deeply out of place. As concern intensified, two neighbors who knew the family well decided to check the house in person. They approached the quiet pink home cautiously, calling out for Dee Dee and Gypsy as they walked up the ramp. The windows were dark, the blinds closed, and the yard unusually still. They knocked, they waited. There was no response. Another neighbor arrived shortly after, having seen the Facebook post and felt compelled to help. Together, they tried to determine whether anyone was inside. They checked for movement, listened for sounds, and looked for any sign that the pair might simply be resting or away, but the house remained silent. Eventually, one of the neighbors climbed through a window, carefully entering the home with the intention of checking on their well-being. Inside, the air felt still, with no signs of activity. The wheelchair that Gypsy was believed to rely on sat motionless. The rooms were quiet, undisturbed, and unexpectedly empty. What they discovered next led them to immediately call law enforcement. The police arrived quickly, aware of the unusual circumstances and the disturbing online message. Officers entered the home, moving carefully through the hallway and into the bedroom. There, they found the body of Dee Dee Blanchard. The scene was somber, documented factually in investigatory reports, and described publicly only in non-graphic terms. It was clear that something violent had occurred. But alongside that devastating discovery came another urgent question. Where was Gypsy? Based on the medical history publicly known at the time, many believed she could not walk on her own, could not travel independently, and required daily assistance. The absence of her wheelchair inside the house only deepened the urgency. Officers and neighbors alike feared that Gypsy had been taken, perhaps harmed, or was somewhere in immediate danger. Information spread rapidly through Springfield. Friends called one another, volunteers reached out to hospitals, and local residents began sharing the news online. Gypsy was officially reported as missing, and law enforcement released statements urging the public to keep watch for her. The assumption, widely held at the time, was that she was a vulnerable young woman whose life could be at serious risk. Within hours, the story reached local media outlets, prompting even greater public concern. Community members who had donated time, money, and support felt overwhelming fear for her safety.
The images of Gypsy that had circulated for years, smiling, appearing medically fragile, often photographed in costumes or at charity events, now carried a new weight. People wondered whether she was somewhere frightened, hurt, or desperate for help. Law enforcement expanded their search, coordinating with neighboring states and reviewing digital clues that could reveal where Gypsy might be. Officers examined the Facebook post that sparked the alarm, trying to determine its origin, its timing, and its authorship. They gathered statements from neighbors, friends, and anyone who had communicated with Dee Dee in recent days. As the night stretched into early morning, Springfield held its breath. The discovery of Dee Dee's body had already shaken the community. But the fear surrounding Gypsy's disappearance, combined with the belief that she relied heavily on medical care, created an atmosphere of urgent uncertainty. No one yet knew that within a matter of hours, the investigation would take a dramatic turn, one that would transform the case from a missing persons search into a story that would capture national attention. For now, the house remained sealed behind police tape, its stillness watched by neighbors standing on their porches, waiting for any update about the young woman they believed to be in danger. The Facebook post that triggered it all continued to spread online, the mystery deepening with every refresh of the page. And as officers worked through the early hours, they were unaware that the answers they sought were already hundreds of miles away, traveling through the digital footprints left behind by two individuals whose journey had begun long before the events of that June night.
As dawn broke over Springfield on June 15, 2015, the urgency surrounding the disappearance of Gypsy Rose intensified. Overnight, the news of Dee Dee Blanchard's death and Gypsy's absence had spread rapidly through social media, local bulletins, and urgent community alerts. Many people who had supported the family over the years now found themselves fearing the worst, that Gypsy, believed to be medically vulnerable, was somewhere in immediate danger. Law enforcement worked through the early morning hours, piecing together digital traces, reviewing phone records, and analyzing the Facebook posts that had first alerted the community. With the belief that Gypsy was unable to walk or travel without assistance, investigators approached the case as a potential kidnapping, treating every clue with heightened seriousness. The turning point came when officers began tracking the origin of the Facebook post. Information from the platform, combined with digital forensics, led them to an unexpected location, a small town in Wisconsin. This development shifted the investigation dramatically. What it seemed like a local disappearance now pointed to a journey far beyond Missouri's borders. Authorities in Wisconsin were contacted immediately, and coordination between state agencies escalated. The address tied to the post was identified, and a plan was set in motion to approach the residents with caution, aware that they were now dealing with a homicide investigation and a missing person case intertwined. When officers arrived at the home in Wisconsin, they surrounded the residents carefully, prepared for multiple possibilities. The situation was treated as high risk, given the assumption that Gypsy might be held against her will or in need of urgent medical assistance. Neighbors in the area looked on quietly as law enforcement vehicles arrived, unaware of the national attention the case would soon receive. Upon entering the home, officers located both individuals they had been searching for. Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn were found together, and contrary to the widespread belief in Springfield, Gypsy was able to walk, speak, and move independently. The revelation was immediate, unexpected, and deeply shocking to law enforcement. What they witnessed stood in contrast to the public narrative that had reached them only hours earlier. Gypsy was taken into custody, not as a victim in immediate danger, but as someone connected to a homicide investigation. Officers ensured she was safe, examined her condition, and transported her for questioning. Nicholas was also taken into custody without incident. The arrests occurred calmly, documented through standard procedures that would later become part of official reports. Back in Springfield, the news reached investigators quickly, initiating a profound shift in understanding. The young woman who had been believed to require a wheelchair, feeding tubes, and constant medical supervision was now walking unassisted. The assumption that Gypsy had been abducted or harmed gave way to a new reality, one that raised far more questions than answers. As word spread, the public reaction grew rapidly. Many who had supported the family struggled to process the sudden change in narrative. Volunteers who had organized charity events were shocked to learn Gypsy could walk. Neighbors who had watched her being transported in a wheelchair expressed disbelief. For years, Springfield had viewed Gypsy through a very specific lens, shaped entirely by what they had been told. Now that perception had collapsed in a single moment. Law enforcement released cautious statements, acknowledging that Gypsy had been located safely, clarifying that her physical condition differed from what had been widely believed, and confirming that both she and Nicholas were connected to the ongoing investigation into Dee Dee's death. The information was delivered factually, without assumptions, as officers emphasized that the case was complex and evolving. News coverage spread quickly across the country. The combination of a discovered homicide, a missing person alert, and the unexpected revelation about Gypsy's physical abilities captured national attention almost immediately. Journalists reported the details with growing urgency, noting the sharp contrast between the long-held public narrative and the facts emerging from the investigation. In Wisconsin, Gypsy and Nicholas were questioned separately. Officers worked to understand the sequence of events, the decisions that led to the journey from Missouri, and the circumstances surrounding the death of Dee Dee Blanchard. Statements from investigators later confirmed that Gypsy was cooperative, answering questions and providing information that helped piece together the timeline. The rapid change in public perception, from viewing Gypsy as an endangered victim to recognizing her involvement in the case, created a wave of confusion and disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the two images, the vulnerable young woman photographed at charity events, and the adult now walking without assistance and under arrest for her role in a homicide investigation. As the hours passed, authorities prepared for extradition back to Missouri, where formal charges would follow. Gypsy and Nicholas were processed according to standard procedure, and law enforcement continued gathering evidence, reviewing digital communications, and interviewing witnesses connected to the family's history. The arrest marked the moment when the story expanded beyond Springfield, becoming a national headline and sparking questions about caregiving, control, and the unseen complexities that may exist behind a carefully maintained public life. For now, however, the focus remained on returning the two individuals to Missouri, where the legal process would begin, a process that would soon reveal a deeper, more complicated history behind the events of June 2015.
When Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn were returned to Missouri, investigators began the difficult work of understanding not only the events of June 2015, but the years that had led up to them. What emerged in the days that followed was not a simple story, and not one that could be reduced to a single moment or motive. Instead, it was a complex history pieced together from legal documents, family statements, medical records, and the observations of law enforcement who were seeing the full picture for the first time. From the outside, Dee Dee and Gypsy had appeared to share a life built on medical vulnerability and constant care. But as investigators reviewed the family's history, a different narrative began to surface, one that revealed patterns of long-term control and restricted autonomy that had gone largely unnoticed by the community. Court documents and publicly available records later detailed a timeline showing how Gypsy's independence had been limited for many years. These records included information about decisions made on her behalf, frequent relocations during her childhood, and the absence of consistent verification surrounding the medical claims presented publicly. Investigators found that much of Gypsy's life had been shaped by conditions she believed she had, because those were the conditions she had been told she lived with. The emerging picture was one of a young woman whose understanding of herself was built almost entirely on what she had been taught to believe. As the investigation expanded, family members from Louisiana came forward, providing additional context about earlier years. Their statements, included in media interviews and legal proceedings, added details about the family's past, details that stood in contrast to the public image Springfield had known. These accounts became part of the broader understanding of how the mother-daughter relationship had functioned long before moving to Missouri.
Professionals familiar with cases involving excessive medical care and fabricated or exaggerated illness began publicly discussing a term that appears in medical literature, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This term was referenced by journalists, doctors, and investigators as a framework used by professionals to describe patterns of behavior in certain cases. Importantly, it was discussed only from the standpoint of recognized criteria and expert commentary, not as a diagnosis applied directly by the documentary narrator or by those without medical authority. What investigators focused on factually and without speculation was the clear evidence of long-term control. Court records documented how Gypsy's access to identification was restricted. Her age was reportedly misrepresented at times. Her ability to interact with others privately was limited, and her understanding of her own medical needs was shaped by information she had been given throughout her life. These findings did not excuse the events of June 2015, nor did they diminish the seriousness of the crime. Instead, they provided essential context about the circumstances that shaped Gypsy's worldview, her decisions, and her emotional state leading up to that summer. The unfolding details painted a picture of a young woman navigating a world where her autonomy had been tightly managed, her sense of identity influenced by years of external control. As these revelations became public, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Some people responded with shock, struggling to reconcile the mother they had known, the friendly woman who spoke at charity events, who received local support, who attended medical appointments with calm confidence, with the new information emerging from official records. Others expressed sympathy for Gypsy, seeing her as someone who had lived under extreme constraints and made choices in a moment of desperation. News outlets across the country began reporting on the case with increasing depth, exploring the relationship between medical authority, caregiving, and control. Documentaries, interviews, and investigative articles examined the timeline of events, the household environment, and the complex psychological dynamics that can exist in situations where one individual holds significant power over another. Law enforcement spokespeople, appearing in press briefings, emphasized that the case was multifaceted. They acknowledged the seriousness of Dee Dee's death, the evidence collected in the home, and the legal responsibility of those involved. At the same time, they confirmed that the background of the family played an important role in understanding the path that led to June 2015. For many people following the case, the revelations created a difficult emotional response. The story no longer fit the simple narrative of a mother caring for a sick daughter, nor did it fit a straightforward criminal storyline. Instead, it revealed a troubled history that had existed quietly beneath years of public admiration and community support. As investigators continued reviewing digital communications, talking to extended family, and analyzing medical documentation, one truth became clear. The reality inside the home on West Volunteer Way had been far more complicated than anyone outside it had understood. And the complexity of that reality would play a central role in the legal proceedings that were about to unfold, shaping how the court viewed the actions of both Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn.
The legal process that followed the arrests of Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn unfolded with careful attention, extensive documentation, and a deep awareness of the complexities surrounding the case. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and investigators all approached the proceedings with the understanding that this was not a typical homicide case. The circumstances that had shaped the years leading up to June 2015 were central to evaluating the actions of everyone involved. For Gypsy, the court proceedings began with a series of assessments, interviews, and legal consultations. The prosecution acknowledged the seriousness of Dee Dee's death, presenting the evidence collected from the home, the timeline of events, and the communication between Gypsy and Nicholas. At the same time, the defense focused on the environment in which Gypsy had lived, highlighting the extensive control documented in legal and investigative records.
These details, drawn from verified sources, shaped the foundation of the defense strategy. As the discussions progressed, the court considered the evidence not only as a matter of criminal conduct, but within the broader context of years of restriction, manipulation, and limited autonomy. Prosecutors recognized that Gypsy's understanding of her circumstances had been shaped by a lifetime of information that may not have reflected her actual physical condition. Because of this, the case required a nuanced approach, balancing accountability with acknowledgement of the environment in which her decisions were made. In July 2015, Gypsy accepted a plea agreement. She pled guilty to second-degree murder, a charge that carried a lighter sentence than first-degree murder, reflecting the complexity of the circumstances. The court sentenced her to 10 years in prison. For many observers, the plea deal represented a legal recognition of the unique factors at play: the years of restricted independence, the documented control within the household, and the influence those conditions had on the choices Gypsy made. In court, Gypsy appeared calm, speaking respectfully and answering questions clearly. Reports from the time noted her composed demeanor, as well as her acknowledgement of the seriousness of the situation. With the plea deal finalized, her role in the legal process shifted from active defendant to sentenced inmate, beginning a new chapter in her life under the supervision of the state. Nicholas Godejohn's legal journey moved on a different trajectory. Unlike Gypsy, he did not accept a plea deal. His case proceeded to a full jury trial, where prosecutors presented a detailed account of his involvement in Dee Dee's death. The trial included digital evidence, interviews, travel records, and statements made during his questioning. The defense addressed his emotional connection to Gypsy and the influence her requests had on his actions, but the prosecution maintained that his direct role in Dee Dee's death warranted the most serious charges. In late 2018, after a lengthy trial, Nicholas was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The court sentenced him to life in prison for the murder charge and an additional 25 years for the armed criminal action. His sentencing reflected the court's assessment of his primary involvement in the events inside the home on West Volunteer Way. With both sentences delivered, the public began reflecting on the case from a broader perspective. Documentaries, long-form articles, and televised interviews revisited the timeline, exploring the layers of caregiving, control, and secrecy that had shaped the Blanchard household. Many discussions focused on the systems that failed to detect abnormalities earlier, the lack of consistent verification across medical care, the ease with which records were accepted, and the difficulty outsiders often face in recognizing signs of manipulation or control. Public opinion remained deeply divided. Some viewed Gypsy's sentence as a necessary consequence of her involvement in a homicide. Others expressed sympathy, seeing her as someone who had acted after years of confinement and limited autonomy. Many felt conflicted, understanding both the tragedy of Dee Dee's death and the seriousness of the circumstances that led Gypsy to seek a way out. Legal experts who reviewed the case often emphasized its uniqueness. It involved issues of caregiving, medical misinformation, dependency, and the psychological impact of long-term control. The court's decisions reflected this complexity, a combination of accountability, recognition of circumstances, and careful evaluation of each individual's role. Over time, the story continued to re-emerge through interviews with family members, statements from law enforcement, and Gypsy's own reflections from prison. Documentary producers and journalists approached the case with renewed depth, examining not only the events themselves, but the broader implications from medical oversight, social services, and public understanding of hidden abuse. As the legal process came to a close, one truth became clear. The case of Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard was not just a story of a crime, but a story of a life shaped by years of controlled narrative, unseen complexities, and a final act that forced the world to confront realities that had gone unnoticed for too long. It raised questions that extended well beyond the courtroom, questions that would continue shaping conversations long after the sentencing was complete. In the years that followed the sentencing of Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn, the case of Dee Dee Blanchard continued to leave a deep and complex imprint on the public consciousness. What began as a homicide investigation inside a small pink home in Springfield gradually transformed into a broader conversation, one that extended far beyond criminal proceedings and into questions about trust, vulnerability, caregiving, and the unseen realities that can exist behind closed doors. Communities across the country watched as documentaries, investigative series, and long-form interviews revisited the timeline of events with care and detail. Journalists examined the circumstances that shaped the Blanchard household, exploring how a narrative so widely accepted by neighbors, medical professionals, charitable organizations, and even extended family members could exist for so long without deeper scrutiny. These discussions were not centered on blame, but on understanding, an attempt to look closely at the systems, assumptions, and human dynamics that allowed the situation to remain hidden for years. For many viewers, the case prompted a reflection on the nature of caregiving itself. Dee Dee had been regarded as a devoted mother, someone who navigated medical complexities with patience and determination. Yet the investigation revealed a different environment, one marked by strict control and limitations that shaped nearly every aspect of Gypsy's life. This contrast forced people to reconsider how easily outward appearances can mask private struggles and how difficult it can be for outsiders to recognize signs of manipulation or restricted autonomy when the public narrative seems consistent and compassionate. The case also sparked discussions within the fields of social work, healthcare coordination, and community support. Professionals examined how medical information had been transferred, how records had been interpreted, and how assumptions had been made without consistent verification. The goal of these examinations was not to point fingers, but to learn, to understand how similar situations might be prevented, how vulnerable individuals can be better protected, and how lines of communication between agencies might be strengthened in the future. As these discussions unfolded, Gypsy's life continued within the structure of her sentence. From prison, she participated in interviews where she described her upbringing, her understanding of her circumstances, and her reflections on the decisions that led to June 2015. These interviews were met with a wide range of reactions, some empathetic, some critical, many simply contemplative. For a large part of the public, Gypsy's voice added another layer of complexity to a case already marked by difficult truths. With time, Gypsy grew older, developing a clearer sense of identity outside the environment that shaped her childhood and early adulthood. Reports from correctional staff and interviews she gave reflected a young woman learning to navigate life with structure, routine, and independence she had not experienced before. Her reflections often centered on accountability, regret, and growth, while also acknowledging the conditions that influenced her path. In Springfield, the legacy of the case lingered quietly. The home on West Volunteer Way, once a symbol of resilience and charity, became a reminder of a story far more complicated than its outward appearance suggested. Neighbors who had known Dee Dee and Gypsy for years revisited their memories, trying to reconcile the affection they once felt with the new understanding brought forward by the investigation. Many expressed sadness, not only for the life that was lost, but for the years of hidden suffering that preceded the tragedy. Beyond Springfield, the case sparked broader conversations about the nature of hidden abuse. Advocacy groups, mental health practitioners, and social service organizations used the story as an example of how complex such situations can be. They highlighted the importance of listening carefully, approaching concerns with empathy, and creating systems that allow individuals to seek help even when their circumstances appear outwardly stable. The aim was not to draw direct comparisons to other cases, but to encourage awareness, a recognition that vulnerability is not always visible, and that support systems must remain attentive and compassionate. The story of the Blanchard family also influenced public understanding of how easily narratives can form and how difficult they can be to see through. For years, communities accepted what they were told, believing wholeheartedly in the version of events they observed. The case served as a reminder that certainty can sometimes obscure complexity, and that even the most familiar stories may hold hidden layers. As the years passed, the case continued to be referenced in documentaries, academic discussions, and public forums, not because people sought sensationalism, but because the story reflected something much more universal: the fragile intersection of trust, vulnerability, and control. It offered lessons about oversight, about community responsibility, and about the importance of examining care with both empathy and clarity. For many who followed the case from the beginning, the legacy of the Blanchard story is multi-layered. It is a cautionary account of missed signs, of assumptions made in good faith, and of the quiet suffering that can exist behind carefully maintained appearances. It is also a reflection on resilience, the resilience of a young woman who, despite the circumstances of her upbringing, has expressed a desire to build a different future, one defined by self-understanding and accountability. And for Springfield, the memory remains, not as a sensation, but as a chapter that reshaped the community's understanding of compassion, vigilance, and the quiet responsibilities that each neighbor holds toward one another. The pink house that once stood as a symbol of charitable support now serves as a reminder that even in close-knit communities, truth can remain hidden for years, protected by routines, assumptions, and the familiar comfort of what people believe to be true. As the documentary closes, the story of Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose stands not as a simple tale of crime, but as a profound reminder of how complex human relationships can be, how difficult it is to see behind practiced narratives, and how important it is to remain attentive to those who may be silently struggling. It is a story that continues to shape conversations, to challenge assumptions, and to encourage deeper understanding of the fragile spaces where care and control can become intertwined. Share this story. Keep the conversation alive, because some truths remain hidden for years, until the courage to speak finally brings them into the light.